Hello, welcome everybody. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to this panel and hand it over to my esteemed colleagues. I'm Johanna Burton. I'm the director and Keith Haring director and curator of education and public engagement here at the New Museum. And I am delighted that we are hosting this event, which is associated with the book launch of Sarah Thornton's 33 Artists in 3 Acts, which we will hear a good deal about. You may know Sarah's work from her previous best-selling 7 Days in the Art World, which provided a kind of sociological inquiry into what we call the art world, and I think put it into question in some ways as well. So today on the panel we have 3 of the figures who are in 33 Artists in 3 Acts, and with that I'm actually going to turn it over to our artistic director, Massimiliano Gioni, who is in the book. It's unclear if he's an artist. We'll maybe get to that. But who will moderate the panel and introduce everybody more properly. So with that, thank you and welcome. I think we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then if you have questions, we'll hand it over to you. So welcome. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. As Joanna said, I'm in the book. I think I'm in the book actually because I used to be somebody else. I used to interpret Maurizio Cattelan's at lectures, and I think part of that is discussed by Sarah in the book. So now I have the luxury of being myself, which I don't know if it's a promotion or a demotion, but I'll be mostly just serving the role of a moderator and let Sarah and particularly Laurie Simmons and Andrea Fraser talk about themselves and about each other and about the book. The book is titled 33 Artists in 3 Acts. As Joanna mentioned, it comes after the great success of 7 Days in the Art World, which was published in 2008 and became best book in the New York Times, I think, in 2008, and was translated in 16 languages. I think on many levels, 33 Artists in 3 Acts is a book that I like more than 7 Days in the Art World. If 7 Days in the Art World particularly was rooted in I think the explosion of the market, even though it came out the year of the recession. And I think with this book instead, Sarah is looking at the art world or the art worlds, but most importantly is focusing on a question we all ask ourselves and each other, and the question is, what is an artist? The assumption of the book is that artists use their own personas as they use oil and canvases and photography and cameras. Maybe we don't all believe that, but I think it's quite an interesting starting point. As Damien Hirst says at one point in the book, your image is something you wear. And I think with many caveats around it, Sarah shares this point of view. Or to use another example, she probably shares Ernest Gombrich's famous incipit beginning of his history of art, in which he says that there is no such a thing as a history of art, there is only a history of artists. So what is an artist? I think from the book there are some great quotes I'm going to list in random order. An artist is an enemy of general sensibilities, according to Ai Weiwei. He's a solitary philosopher, according to Zhang Fengzi. Art is not a job for the artist, just as religion is not a job for a priest, which I really like, by Clutata Daman. You don't have to be a nice person to be an artist, and this is something as a curator I strongly believe in. I don't know what art does for people who look at it, but it saves people who make it. This is Maurizio Cattelan. Another great definition by Francis Alisi says, I'm a midwife. I'm not an inventor, I'm just the person on the other side. And one, I think, of the greatest definition that is actually by Andrea Fraser, she says, an artist is a myth. And actually the closing line of the book, so this is a spoiler alert, she says, I'm not unique. Actually, she's far from being unique because her role in the book is to be a sort of multiple self. But she says, I'm not unique, just a particular instance of the possible. So today also I should say a few words about Laurie and Andrea, who are prominently featured in the book. They're both great artists, and that's a good way to start a book about artists. And Laurie, I'm sure you know her photographic work, and she's preparing an exhibition at the St. Louis Museum and at the Jewish Museum coming up. And she also told me to mention that she's preparing a portfolio for New Yorkers against gun violence, which will be released in December, and for which I think she's particularly proud or really engaged in. And Andrea Fraser, she's also preparing 2 upcoming shows at MACBA in Barcelona and in Salzburg. And she's also on the board of WAGE, which maybe we can also talk about, speaking of artist responsibilities. I think we'll speak more about the book and its structure. It's divided in 3 acts, one focused on politics, another on kinship, and the last one on craft. As Sarah says, she decided to organize the book in acts because she thinks of artists as some actors or in a certain capacity. And it's going to be up to you to decide if it's a commedia dell'arte or an Edward Albee psychodrama. And I'll actually would like to start asking the artists, since they've been described and portrayed by Sarah in the book, how they would describe and portray Sarah to the audience.
You first.
Okay. Well, I think that I was interested in talking to Sarah because specifically she is not a journalist. She's an ethnographer, an anthropologist, a sociologist. So I felt really comfortable and excited about being part of the book. And I also thought I might finally get a chance to be in a book that wasn't just in the art section of the bookstore. And that seemed really amazing. And the one thing I'll say about Sarah is that she is not a journalist, but she is really able to get you to speak. She's more like maybe a psychoanalyst. You just want to bare your soul. And so even though she wasn't specifically a journalist, I often found myself protecting myself a little bit from what I might say because of her personality. I think my husband, who is also in the book, had a much more difficult time not succumbing to your winsome ways. I don't know how else to say it, but so what I would say about Sarah is that she is really good at getting people to tell their story. That's my.
I was going to say the same thing.
Go for it. Just say it again.
Yeah, Sarah is extremely good at what she does, which is, I think, seduce people to expose themselves. But I think that she does it in a way that, I think part of being very good at that has to do with a sense of awareness of what those relations are and what's at stake in that sort of self-revelation, and of her own role as a mediator, in some sense, between different worlds, between the very rarefied and still fairly rarefied, yes, less than it used to be, an exclusive and specialized world of contemporary art, and a much wider audience that her books reach. And so part of the seduction is the potential to reach that kind of audience, I think, that she offered the artists that she talked to. And, then the question of, well, what is that representation going to be? Can we trust her? How is she going to translate me and my world to make that accessible to people who would not otherwise be able to access it? And I don't know. Sarah and I share something which is a connection to the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and I first met Sarah actually, I believe, at my book launch when I published my first book, which Bourdieu wrote a foreword to, and that was at Tate Modern in 2005. And Sarah wrote a review of it, which I very much appreciated. But we hadn't really been in touch. And I actually used a chapter of 7 Days in the Art World in one of my classes, the chapter on the art magazine, because in fact there's very, very little written about art discourse, and so I found it really valuable. And could recognize in 7 Days in the Art World the degree to which it was a popular book, clearly, as demonstrated by its worldwide distribution. But the structure of it, how she was looking at the field of art from a standpoint that, at least I saw as coming out of the work of a very specific kind of analysis of the art world. And so translating not only the sort of participants, but also the world itself from, on the one hand, from the field of art, but also from a perspective that comes out of an academic world, from the field of sociology, and opening that up to a wider audience. So there was one thing, I did not let Sarah into my home. I don't think I'm very good at being guarded in what I say, but okay, there's a line I'm going to draw. So I'd love to have you over now that the book is published. I'll have you over for dinner. But that was a whole kind of long negotiation.
But I have seen Andrea naked. So
Oh,
that,
well.
I think that
Yeah, but that's whatever.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, all right, thank you.
Do you think, this is actually a question that Sarah asked me to ask you, but do you think she represented you accurately? Do you recognize yourself, whatever that self is, in her description?
Absolutely.
What about you, Laurie? Because in Laurie's case, it's also quite a fascinating portrait because not only Laurie's feature, but also her husband, Carol Dunham, and her daughters, Grace and Lena. So it's both a individual portrait and a family portrait. How did you feel about yourself and about your family?
I think it's fair to say, I hope I'm not telling tales out of school by saying that I think we spent so much time overall with Sarah that a number of stories were conflated and experiences were sort of blended together. So Sarah very fairly allowed all the artists to read the portions that she wrote about them, which I thought was incredible, which probably caused an amazing amount of trouble for you. But when I read the galleys for the first time and I read the sections about myself, I called Sarah and I said, Sarah, in every scene you have me making matzo balls, serving gluten-free muffins, slicing tomatoes, making sandwiches, pouring lemonade, and this isn't really what happened. And
But well.
okay,
Yeah.
So I saw, I felt everything I said was accurate. I felt everything I did was accurate, but I felt this portrayal of a Jewish mother was sort of, pushing me in a direction that, I don't know what you would have to say about that. I noticed Marina Abramovich was slicing tomatoes. Yeah, okay.
Well,
As well, but
Gabriel Orozco said that everybody is portrayed in his underwear, and some of them get to keep their socks on, which I don't know if
Right.
that makes them more serious or less.
Right.
But I also wanted to ask Sarah maybe to tell us more how the book was born and how it developed. I think you mentioned that you interviewed more than 130 artists in the process, and then it went down to 33 who appear in extended portraits throughout the book. But maybe you want to tell us a bit how the book was born and if and how it relates to 7 Days in the Art World.
Well, when I finished 7 Days in the Art World, I felt like there were two things I really wanted to investigate in greater depth. And one was the art market and one was artists. So I started writing regularly for The Economist and in the end became their chief writer on contemporary art and wrote 65 different articles for them. And at the same time, I was researching this book. 7 Days in the Art World came out in autumn of 2008, and in summer 2009, I met Maurizio Cattelan for the first time. And
That's what you think.
Well, that's true. I'd met Massimiliano, and it's confusing. But he had very kindly given me illustration for the British edition of 7 Days in the Art World, and also about 10 other editions used a work of his, a horse, an untitled work of a horse, butt out, ass outward. And so when we finally met, I think he felt I was a fan. He felt comfortable with me. He was familiar with 7 Days in the Art World. And I just kind of watched the way he went around the Venice Biennial and Art Basel and these various art events. And at that point, it kind of clicked. I thought, these people, what are they doing? How are they doing it? The work, I was a fan of his work. And the work is still, I think, the most important part of the configuration, but for me, an artist's work is everything they do, and so public performances such as this, their interactions with their dealers or their choice not to have them, the degree to which they might edition something. I mean, I would really pull in all of those decisions into the work. It's a sociological definition of the work, quite literally, Going back just to what Andrea and Laurie were saying, I mean, I think that I try to be as fair-minded as possible. And in a quite ethnographic way, I think journalists have a different version of what's fair, perhaps, especially British journalists. But, so, at that stage where Laurie did mention the repeated cooking in her scenes. I
don't even cook.
It just so happened you were always cooking when I was there. And okay, I wasn't there all the time. And maybe my presence was an occasion for cooking, which could be part of it as well, actually.
Maybe I wanted to be represented that way. That's another.
It's kind of interesting. So, there was always, even if you weren't cooking, there was a lot of goodies on offer. Mm-hmm. No, she does not want anyone to be hungry.
That is true.
And I appreciated that. And it is quite a contrast often when you go, particularly to men's studios, you kind of have to beg for some water, You rarely get a hot cup of tea and a biscuit or anything like that. But so I actually felt it was fair, and it was starting to get misleading. And it's true, there are distillations. So a scene, sometimes a scene, I'm just trying to think, your first joint scene with Tip, I was actually there for 2 days. But it's distilled into a 2-hour conversation, roughly, and that's just, something I do a lot. Oftentimes, a solo scene. So the artists who have solo scenes in the book, I might still have interviewed them 3 times. So it's just a question of getting enough of the right kind of material, and also sometimes letting people go away and think about things and then come back to me. And the artists who have recurring scenes often evolve their thought over the course of those scenes, and things happen to them that change their being. Ai Weiwei gets put in jail and then comes out of jail. I mean, this is kind of pretty life-changing experiences. Lena, who, when I first meet you, has yet to start work for HBO and win Golden Globes and all that kind of thing, gets shot out of a cannon and becomes relevant to a lot of the questions I'm asking Tip and Laurie about how they deal with competition with each other and how their sense of self is, weathers moments where perhaps they're in the studio having a tough time and their other half is being celebrated with it, 3 rave reviews in a row or whatever. I don't know if that answered.
Did you cast the artists that ended up being in the book? I mean, did you go through a period of selection that you would speak to more people, and do you want to talk about how that developed? How do you come down to these 33? Or
I see the book as both.
And did you as artists feel that she was casting you?
I think the book is both curated and cast. The work needed to be relevant to me, and I hazard to use a cliche, to our times, but also the work is definitely the book is definitely cast insofar as most of the people in the book were willing to collaborate with me and engage with my questions. And some of the people who were left on the cutting room floor, some actually very famous, wonderful artists actually, were just not willing to tackle my questions. So the book is biased towards collaborators. That's not to say everyone in the book wanted to collaborate, and there are at least 3 artists in the book who made it known to me they'd rather not be in the book, but I kept them in anyway.
Well, Katie Nolan.
Well, there are some W.W. Norton people in the audience who would kill me if I responded directly to that,
All right.
given our agreements with Ms. Noland. But yes, it's a very complicated.
There's a footnote.
Yes, exactly. There is a footnote. But she's not the only one not to approve, I guess you could say. And I think too, some people perhaps have certain mixed feelings about being presented in their underwear with socks. So it was very tough. After interviewing 100 artists, it was only then that I came up with my three themes. And they did really seem to emerge from the material: politics, kinship, and craft. The first reason those became my themes is because they were the things that seemed to distinguish artists from non-artists. They took the definition of artist to its edge. Are you an artist or are you an activist? Are you an artist or are you a didactic illustrator? Artist or politician? That is actually kind of part of the ideology of the art world. Same with, are you an artist or are you a craftsman? This is perhaps a more long-standing, perhaps just as long-standing distinction. And then with kinship, that becomes a gender issue in part, where, are you an artist or are you a hobbyist who lives in the shadow of your, starry artist husband, or things like that. And then those 3 themes happen to appeal to me greatly because I think they're a way of bringing contemporary art to a much broader audience. Those are themes that mean a lot to lots of people. They're very universal, especially if you interpret politics to be, ethics, human rights, freedom of speech. I mean, very kind of basic political values. Kinship being about, muse relationships, collaboration, self-motivation, and even love in the end, thanks to a brilliant quote from Massimiliano. And craft. I mean, I think we all, most of us in the middle classes care about our work. We care about the execution of our work. We want to do a good job, and it's perhaps more than just a job. It's a career, and so. At that point, the culling partly had to do with which artists would fit in with those themes and embellish those themes. And it was very difficult, actually, especially cutting the last 20.
Is there somebody
And the class 10.
that you regret the most? I don't know if you want to say the name, but
I'd really rather not say in public because...
it's not public, it's a group of friends. Many
I
museum
think
members.
I ran into trouble with the acknowledgements of 7 Days in the Art World in Britain for various very complicated reasons. And so I decided early on that I would not list all the artists that I interviewed in this book. I didn't want anyone to feel the indignity of being left out. When a curator is doing studio visits for a group show or their biennial, they do not publicize the list of artists they did studio visits with. And so I just felt like it was the same kind of thing.
Yeah. So two questions actually. One, they're both two critical questions. One absence I felt in the book, and it's obvious because it's not in the premise of the book, is the work rather than the artist. I always have a terrible joke that I make with artists. I say the artist is a byproduct of the artwork, and I'm interested in the artwork, or now they're going to slap me, or the artist is the shell that you have to open to get to the pearl. And
I agree with you.
And so, and I think the other question is, which is related to the first one, is because we live in a celebrity culture, in a attention economy, speaking about artists has become complicit with a certain series of problems that, if I think also of Andrea's work, are addressed in your own work. So the question is both to Sarah and to all of you, did you feel your work goes across? And I don't want to be unfair with the question.
Can I answer first? And then,
Sure.
then you can all gang up on me.
The other question is the problem of fame. If there was obviously it sells more book, the more famous the artists are, but was that a question you had to get your head around? Are you making a celebrity list, or how do you offset that? And I'm curious, really, from the point of view of the writer, how did you address that?
I think there are some celebrities in the book, like Ai Weiwei and Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst, but actually, I don't think anybody else in the book counts really as a celebrity. And, Andrea, my pinup, is extremely well known in the art world, but actually, even like the collector world is not so familiar, and certainly most of the anyway. But I think, you could also say that the artwork is the byproduct of the artist. I mean, one could turn it on its head. I think there's a very strong ideology within the art world that one should only talk about the work, and it is a way of disenfranchising sociological exploration of the way the system works and the mythification of this role. I agree 100% with Andrea's definition, an artist is a myth. And if you can only talk about the work, if that's the only sanctioned, proper, correct thing to do within our art world, then you have no hope in hell of unpacking that myth. And I think the myths are part of the magic of art. Actually, they imbue art with greater power. And that's why it can be so rewarding to go to a solo retrospective, because you actually have all the work together coming from that voice. And often the backstory of the artist or tidbits of narrative become part of the work. And so I think, the art world is very conformist, and that is a very conformist kind of question to me. It's also a curator's perspective, and it's your job to do that.
Yeah.
It is partly your job to do that, but I don't see that as my job. And actually, I feel like I kind of break ranks with the art world when I do write something like this. And I could say more about fame, but
I think it was, did you have something you wanted to say?
I can go.
I think that I was really clear about what Sarah's intention and motives were with this book. And, please remember that I come from, my generation came right after a generation that felt it was unseemly to put an image of yourself, quotes from yourself. We were supposed to really hang back as artists. And I knew artists that wouldn't speak about their work. I knew artists that wouldn't agree to be interviewed. And that was the generation that I tremendously expected right before my generation. So I've had to sort of adapt to a world where the artist does, in order to survive, there's a certain degree of having to put yourself forward. And it took me a really long time to be able to talk about my work in public and present myself along with the work. And I feel that there are many places to see the work or study the work. And I do agree with Sarah that that's part of your job. And I think that Sarah's was very clear about this question, what is an artist? And because of my sort of bridging, having one foot in two worlds, where I come from and where I find myself now, I felt that it was a very relevant question. And just a quick anecdote, a month or so ago, I was moderating a panel at the Chicago Art Institute about the work of my late friend and artist, Sarah Charlesworth, and everyone was so prepared. The panel went really well. And afterwards, I sat next to one of the collectors that had funded the show. And he said, it was just amazing to hear you all talk. And I was so stunned because, and I'm like, yeah, because you were all so normal. And I thought to myself for a second, I thought, if you think Kate Linker, Liz Duchenne, Sarah Vanderbeek, and Laurie Simmons are normal, number one, I don't know where to go with that, but number two, I thought, am I doing my job well? If this was a description that this collector chose to, there's so much about the perception of an artist now, and there's so much about an expectation. And it actually helped me to be able to speak about my work in 1997 when I had my first museum show at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and I was terrified. I had so much speaking to do, and I started to ask myself, what do people want? What do they want to see? What do they want to hear me say? And although I feel I'm honest when I speak, it was the first time I thought in terms of a construct that had to be an artist. Or to be more direct, the first time I thought of myself as an artist construct, which may sound really awful, but I think it helped me to get from one place to another.
Andrea, I think your work particularly addressed the question of how, as an individual, you exist in public, and as an artist, you exist in public. So, I mean, now maybe we are using the book more as a trampoline to discuss how and if you sit down and consciously conceive a persona, because I think that's also a fascinating question in the book, which is, does the artist construct his or her personas for strategic reasons, or...
I don't believe that. I mean, my work, I think the first work that I still present when I give lectures from 1984, when I was 18 years old, is about the representation of artists in art history. It's a little artist book in the form of an exhibition brochure that collages with de Kooning and Raphael's work superimposed, and then the text collages sort of fragments of accounts of those artists and their work from the complete works of Raphael and de Kooning retrospectives. And that was all about how are artists represented? How are artists represented in art history? How are artists represented in art institutions? Which for me was also always a central part of my investigation. You know, I'm associated with institutional critique, so for me that was never about the artist against the institution. It was always recognizing that artists were one of the, if not the central institutions of the field of art. But I mean, as young artists developed, I think this process is often sort of, we forget about it, you know. We hear about Van Gogh. We hear about the genius of Van Gogh. We hear about the genius of Michelangelo, the genius of Da Vinci, the genius of the revolutionary, the radicality. There's the scale of the myth is enormous, and it's extraordinarily compelling. And it's extraordinarily compelling, I think, particularly to young people who don't feel like they fit for various reasons, and feel the need to find ways to not only to express themselves, but to exist in a world in which they don't feel that they necessarily belong. But the institutions of art, you know, and not only the institutions that are specifically devoted to art, but all of the, you know, the sort of forms of media in which we find representations of artists now produce and reproduce these myths. And they're obviously extraordinarily compelling myths. If they weren't, the art world would not have expanded to the degree that it has in the past 20 years. And that doesn't just have to do with the influx of wealth, and it doesn't just have to do, it has to do with the fact that there are so many people who want to be a part of that world and who find that myth so extraordinarily compelling, and who invest in it, and who want to see themselves in it, and who want to be part of it, and who want to emulate it. And certainly that was my development as well. But somehow, at an early age, I realized that I also needed to think about what that myth was. I mean, I'm a second-generation artist, although my mother didn't have a professional career. She was extremely committed as an artist until I was about, I guess she stopped when I was about 4 or 5. But it was part of my childhood. So that myth was not only one that I received from institutions outside of the family, it was also an aspiration that was deeply embedded in my relationship with family members, which I think is one of the reasons why the kinship section is so important and compelling. But so in some ways, I have this fantasy, which is the kind of my core fantasy of being someone says, I can't remember who says that we always want to be the only artist. You talk about wanting to be the only child.
I think.
So I have this
actually-
fantasy that I'm actually,
Tip said it at
even
the
though
end,
there are
yeah.
33 artists,
Yeah,
I'm the favorite.
you are. But
And that's my fantasy. But part of that has to do with, that I feel like I've been cast as sort of what's the word? How do you say it?
Ventriloquist,
To ventriloquize.
which is, of course, the theme in
To be
Laurie's
the
work.
sort of because
to be ventriloquial.
to sort of articulate the sort of sociological in some sense. And because, I mean, in terms of how the work is represented, my first chapter gets to be Official Welcome, where I'm performing the field of possible artistic positions at the time when it was written, which was 2001. And so that kind of first chapter gets to be just that work. And I feel that it's put to really very, very good use, so.
Laura, you wanted to add something?
Oh,
about-
I think that you speak to one amazing point that, I don't know if it's discussed in the book, but certainly I was drawn, it's kind of a chicken or an egg thing. I was drawn to being an artist because I was a disenfranchised child, and I was told that I was awful and terrible, and that's probably because I was an artist, and that, being an artist was an excuse for everything I did that was negative or different was the word that was often used. I think that the world has changed, and the desire to become an artist is no longer coming from the place of being disenfranchised as much as a place of thinking, I could be a rock star there. Whatever motivated somebody to be a rock star is now motivating an artist to, motivating a young person to be fill in the blank, an artist, a chef. We have our new sort of, a filmmaker, we have our new hierarchy of what is cool to be. So I think for younger artists, how they got from there to here is completely different than it might be for you or for me or for my husband.
Well, with students, I kind of can go through a list, why do you want to be an artist? What matters to you? Is it because, anyway, no, I can't remember what the list is, but
And Sarah, you want
it
to...
can be a very long list. Because I only gave you half an answer before in relation. I
I had
answered
another
the
question, but
about
can I
the
ask you a
work.
question and then you answer both?
Okay.
What were the myths that you set out to criticize or destroy or deconstruct?
I don't see myself as a destroyer of myths at all, actually. The art world needs its myths. Art needs its myth. There are some myths that I don't find very credible, personally, and other myths that I find very engaging and appealing. You mentioned earlier, Francis Elise, when I ask him what kind of artist he is, he describes himself as a midwife. I'm just the guy on the side. And I actually found that captured my imagination nicely because, the whole abstract expressionist and previous myth around that kind of fused virility and creativity and kind of suggested progeny and artworks were one and the same is, for me, a much less persuasive and engaging myth. And you kind of can see that myth being evoked by Jeff Koons in various ways. He talks about the human narrative is a biological narrative, he says, and there's lots of ways in which kind of sex and art and his virility is put on the line subtly through all his scenes. And he does have 8 children, of course, as well. A fact that comes out in every interview he does. So, I think that just drawing attention to them is not necessarily to debunk them, and I leave it to the reader to judge who they feel persuaded by. I don't think anyone reading the book is going to feel convinced by every artist in its pages. And, you can pick and choose your way. The art world is a consensus of belief. Contemporary art is about belief, particularly since Duchamp, who kind of made it an artistic concern. 19th century painters had credibility problems, but as soon as you start bringing urinals into the equation, and you give artists the godlike ability to designate something as art, you put a lot of pressure on their authority, and their authority usually requires a little bit of myth-making in order to have power.
Well, what would they be convinced of? I'm sorry, you said you don't expect everyone to be convinced, but...
I mean, I think, they will be convinced of the artist's realness almost. I mean, it's funny, when you're in the midst of an interview with, really almost every artist in the book will, at the beginning of the interview, say, well, since Warhol, there's no such thing as authenticity. It's all about artifice. We can be, performing our roles in different ways. But 3 hours into the interview, it'll come out, oh, but he's not a real artist.
Somebody.
It's somebody's not a real artist, but it's a contested identity. It's hard won. You have to fight for it. Not everyone. Another one of the myths. Not anyone can be an artist. Well, we know that's not true. You may very well declare yourself an artist, but do your parents think you're an artist? You know what I mean? You need societal buy-in. And actually, I've interviewed loads of. The mean year of birth of the artists in the book is 1960. And I actually did interview younger artists, but I cut them out of the equation because I was very keen to have these geographical comparisons. And age just brought in a whole other mix of issues and as a sociologist who did my PhD in the sociology of youth, I just felt like I couldn't actually accurately represent generation, even though there are some generational shifts. Can I go back to the celebrity culture question?
Sure.
I just think, when I am a populist. I actually like to try to do my small bit, perhaps like some museums, to speak to a general audience and popularize contemporary art. It's partly because I actually really love it. And so most people don't really like reading about inanimate objects. They actually do not find art criticism to be a compelling book.
Have you done a survey, Sarah? I mean, is that a scientific statement?
Dribs and drabs, fine, but don't try to get them to read over 2,000 words of art criticism. Do you know what I mean? And so then the moment you and I think the thing is there are many descriptions of works of art in here. But there is contextualized, usually using the voice of its maker in some way, shape, or form. And it is, a friend of mine who thought he hated contemporary art but read it because he thought he should, got through the first 2 acts, and he said, I couldn't believe how interesting these artworks were. Because he's interested in people, and the people provided an avenue into the work. And also he's interested in politics and kinship. And those themes provided something that was relevant to him as well. So I think if anyone thinks the book is part of, thinks it's part of celebrity culture, well, then you could say, well, yeah, there are 3 celebrities in the book. And I would say that's really it, actually. And most of the other artists are known, have pockets of being well known, but are not well known internationally and not, in Entertainment Weekly and on any regular basis.
Well,
and one last thing, and then I'm finished. You could disagree with that, I'm sure.
No, I wanted to add a question to it.
Okay, because I have another adjunct. Okay, go ahead.
As a curator, you always have to give the voice to the
There's the question of
artist.
celebrity, and then there's the question of lifestyle.
Can you speak?
There's the question of celebrity, but I'm curious about if you would talk about the lifestyle questions and the representations of the home and of the fashion of the environment and so on. Because that is we had that conversation because it's one of the reasons that I didn't.
I think that what you call lifestyle is for me
what you called lifestyle, actually.
Well, for me, really, it is sociological detail. Mm-hmm. And actually, when people mark themselves socially in public by the shoes they're wearing, and you don't have to read Bourdieu's distinction and his notion and understand fully his notion of habitus to know that there are class associations to foods. you know.
Matzo balls, I know.
Matzo balls. Matzo balls. Yeah, class and ethnic and religious associations. So, you know, for me, all of that sociological detail is a Bourdieuian thing. It really is.
I thought it was the most interesting part of the book, in a certain way, just because I'm so curious about how other artists live, how they roll their game, and you know, an artist's home and studio is so blended oftentimes. I mean, it's really hard to separate their objects and the objects they make, they collect.
Well, but that's the triangulation. I mean, you have the work and the artist, which is where this started, but then you also have the environment. And I guess that's why I was going to lifestyle, because celebrity tends to focus on the person. You know, but of course, we're not only relating to the person, we're relating to their lifestyle. We're relating to their environment. We're relating to the way that they live, and we're projecting ourselves into that representation of a life, of a lifestyle. So I think it's another piece of the kind of triangle. So you're not only representing the artworks in terms of the person, but also an environment, which is not an exhibition. I mean, sometimes it is an exhibition environment, but also the side of production, the side of the sort of home,
It's
a range of
private.
environments. So.
It's private, but, you know, in the case of, you know, Cattelan's little table, small table and chairs, and the modest shed that you described, and Damien Hirst, I mean, these were mind-blowing details that seemed so completely intertwined with the work made by the particular artist. It seemed like it, you know, unless you're going to read every profile in every newspaper or magazine, if the artist is so lucky to get one, these are things that I felt like I never had privy to until I sort of, you know, waded through the chapters of your book.
My PhD supervisor, when I remember practically in my first week he said a good ethnographer has a novelist's eye for detail. And I actually believe that is part of what gives people a strong sense of being there, behind the scenes with people. Otherwise, it kind of floats abstractly around, and it's even harder to remember.
Did you seriously refer to Larry Gagosian as the middleman? You did.
Possibly. I don't know.
Yes.
That was shocking. Really, I was like, she said the so-and-so and the middleman, and I realized she's calling Larry Gagosian a middleman. I thought that was stunning.
I have one thing to say about fame.
Sure.
Because I know I'm so long-winded on the celebrity thing. It's clearly a bee in my bonnet. You've touched a sore point. But not a sore point. But actually, I think fame is part of the art world, internal to the art world as well. It's usually called recognition. And I think that there's a kind of confusion, and different, and maybe Andrea will help me here because her knowledge of psychoanalysis and that kind of thing is deeper than mine. But it seems to me there is a continuum between celebrity, fame, and recognition. And that celebrity is that superficial thing that we love to loathe. Fame is something you gather for your achievement. And recognition is something like a 2-year-old wants. You know what I mean? It's a very deep-seated thing that is about affirming that we've done something good, or that we're of value, or that we are meaningful. And recognition is kind of part of this of the mix in that can of worms called fame.
Well, one of my favorite, you know, what Bourdieu said and how he defined, Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, one of the ways that he defined the specific kind of autonomy of autonomous fields, not only art but scientific fields, is that it's where producers produce only for the recognition of those whom they recognize. And that's where, and which he described as sometimes becoming tiny mutual admiration societies.
And I quote that in the book too.
Do you? Yeah. Oh, I missed it. So, but it's where that distinction or the line often gets, you know, implicitly drawn in an art context between fame and recognition, that recognition comes from experts, recognition comes from peers, recognition comes from those whom one recognizes and in whose authority to recognize one invests, whereas fame and celebrity is recognition by, you know, the general public. it's recognition by those without that kind of specific competence. And so it's a different kind of recognition, and it often gets then articulated in terms of quality versus quantity. I mean, classically, right? Between, the recognition of the elite few, which has a certain kind of value, and the recognition of where fame tends to correspond to that kind of mass recognition, which is how you were describing those three figures as.
And considering that one of the
being a
myths
pinhead.
is not to be recognized, no? That's
Yeah.
that's a
certainly-
paradox also that, at
Certainly,
least
yes.
when I was growing up, and that might have changed, the first
that
stamp of
you-
approval
that
of
you're
being
an
an artist
artist
is the
artist.
refusal. No,
Right, that's what I was
it's,
talking about, the refusal to step up, to acknowledge it, to stay in the background, to let the work speak for you, to be a mysterious figure. I mean, that's where I came from.
Oh, no, I was talking, I was even
Well,
talking about being
but-
refused
but
as a sign of
the work
pride.
Oh,
might
being
have that
rejected,
kind of
yeah.
recognition or
I'm
not.
sorry,
I mean,
yeah.
then there's the question of whether the work has that kind, what kind of recognition the work has, and what kind of recognition the person of, the artist has, the sort of figure of the artist has, which
I wanted
I guess is
to
when we
open
get
it
to
up
celebrity.
to the audience, because in a way we're talking about that. But before we do that, I have two quick questions. One for Sarah, that she should die of her own sword. She asked everybody, what is an artist, and expected an answer in a soundbite. So do you have a soundbite by now? What is an artist for you?
If there was one answer to that question, I
Well,
wouldn't write a book about
It's the
it.
same question you asked all of us.
No, if there was one answer to that question, you couldn't write a book about it. The fact that this role is so highly customizable is part of its fascination for me.
Wow, who was laughing? And then speaking of myths and myths of origins, I want to know, when is the first time you publicly said you were an artist?
I can't
I-
remember.
Mine's
Kindergarten.
documented, yeah. First day of kindergarten, hello, I'm Laurie Simmons, I'm an artist, because well documented in the family, one of the family myths also,
We know that family make that
Yeah.
stuff up, though.
I can kind
Speaking of the environment.
I can kind of remember it, but again, my parents, yes, I did like to draw, and the funny thing was that when I got to art school, I realized I couldn't draw at all. But my whole entire childhood had been predicated on the fact that I could use crayons and colored pencils, but I wasn't a very good draftsman, which was really important. But again, that identity had been given to me to explain away a lot of the way I acted. And I was a transgressive, call it what you will, black sheep in a family of people in post-World War II suburb, and everyone was supposed to sort of walk in order, step in line. And they needed to give me some sort of identity that explained my existence. So the puzzling thing to me is, since I never listened to my parents, particularly my mother, why I allowed her to, number one, choose this identity for me, and number two, why I stuck with it all of these years. So obviously it worked in some way. But I did just want to say that my favorite quote, my favorite answer came from Maurizio Cattelan when he said, "I don't know what art does for the people who look at it, but it saves the people who make it." And for me, when there was so many great answers, but that was the one that I felt like, that's kind of it, Say what you will, but.
Is there for you a moment, a rite of passage from?
No, I don't remember. I mean, basically, I dropped out of high school before I turned 16, and I ended up going to art school because I thought it was the only institution, that would take me. It's the only kind of college I would be able to get into. Which is, I think that it probably was true. So that sort of set me on the course.
So should we open up questions to the audience and take it away? Do we have a microphone that we can? Because sorry, Joanna, to get you to.
I have multiple roles.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about the myth-making, contemporary myth-making for a younger generation of artists born post-1980, let's say. and their use of new media in their own myth-making, and how this has sort of become a self-promotion, maybe, and if this is at all addressed in the book.
There are really no very young artists in the book at all. I actually, in my initial batch of interviews, I did include younger artists, but I found that the kinds of questions I was answering, that I was asking artists who'd had 20 years experience being an artist, were giving me more interesting answers. I felt like if I was going to deal with the immersion sector, it had to be a different book. Maybe my next one, if anyone lets me write another one. I do think, though, that there's, it is quite possible that this notion of an artist, you know, could, like with the next generation, be like, and of course a generation means about 5 years nowadays, but lapse, it's possible. It's funny, because what your question reminded me of an interaction between Inger Dragset and Michael Elmgreen, who are an artistic duo who describe themselves as each half an artist, or a two-headed monster, but then they still manage to have an argument about whether they're an artist or not. And you know, they've represented the both Norway and Denmark in the Venice Biennale. It's they have like a vibrant career as artists, and I wonder if I could read that. Shall I read that? Do you mind? It's 2 paragraphs. So Elmgreen says, I don't have the taste in my mouth or the smell in my nose of being an artist. And Dragset looks kind of disturbed and looks to me for support. And then he says, well, I'm an artist. I wouldn't call myself anything else, just as I'm gay and wouldn't call myself queer. I remember very well making the decision to accept myself as an artist. I had my 30th birthday in New York City, where we had a residency. Up until that point, I had felt embarrassed. Then I thought, fuck it, I can be an artist just as much as anyone else. And then Elmgreen kind of like mischievously taunts his artistic partner. He says, these identity groups are so last century. You were a gay artist in the 20th century. I would say we are far too busy to be artists. We make artworks, do a theatrical performance, publish a book, design a t-shirt, curate a show, so many things. We are like small mice, avoiding being trapped or cornered. Our work is not about universal truths. All we do is tell small lies. You know, so and then another thought about the artist term is Wangechi Mutu, who's a Brooklyn-based artist originally from Kenya, told me that in her native tongue, Kikuyu, there is no word for artist. The closest term is...
Best society ever.
And the closest society the closest term is magician, or somebody who imbues objects with power, which is actually a kind of interesting definition of a ready-made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would like to know why you said best society ever. I have an intuition for that, but I would like you guys
because the
to
comic
express
is
it.
the sentiment of the contrary. So to make you laugh, I say the opposite of what
I
you're
don't
expecting.
believe in that.
Yes, I mean.
No, I really want to know.
Or I could give you a Marcusian answer. I would say in the future everybody will be an artist and energy will flow freely. I was just joking. I think any age in which there has not been art, it was a worrying and terrible age. So, and I mean, believe me, for what I do every single day, I think I prove it. And it was just a joke.
What do you prove?
That I believe we need more art and more artists for everybody.
It's good. Grill him.
Another question.
Thank you. Hi, Sarah. You said something about more people call themselves artists today than at any other time in history. I think that makes it kind of problematic, this wanting more artists. I personally stopped calling myself an artist at the age of 35, which was a while ago. And I don't know, can you tell more about that statement? I think it's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I don't know if I was necessarily celebrating it or not, but I think it is a fact there are more graduates from art programs and more people declaring themselves an artist, and there are probably more people making a living as an artist in some way, shape, or form than ever before. And that, I think, probably does have to do with the stage of capitalism and a whole pile of kind of deeply anthropological, sociological things. I'm not sure I have a definitive stance on it. I think it's good to be able to declare yourself an artist and also renounce the declaration when you feel fit. I mean, Maurizio retired from being an artist. And interestingly, Katie Nolan, who's in the book, evoked her rights under the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990 and took her name off of work. There was a piece called Cowboys Milking coming up at Sotheby's. It was estimated between $200,000 and $300,000. It was slightly bent. And under that act, an artist has a right to disown anything that might damage their reputation. And she did, and then it was worth nothing. That's the market's assessment of the artist brand. But I think the art world does also revolve around artist brands. The non-market aspect also puts a very high premium on these individuals.
Can I ask you a question related to Maurizio's retirement and to many artists who stop making work? And it's a question maybe to the artists. Can you stop being an artist? It's like the Rembrandt used as an ironing board. Does your being an artist is irreversible? And I'm not asking as a provocation, as a joke.
I think I could stop as soon as I decided to stop. And I've thought about stopping so many times. It's amazing how many times I've thought about stopping and how many things I've tried. And now, I'm about to make a feature film, like a real feature film, not an art movie. And so I think maybe I'm a filmmaker. But an interesting thing happened when I was in my daughter's movie. I saw a couple of things written about me that said Laurie Simmons, actress, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my God, I am an artist. It was like as soon as I was so horrified that I called her publicist to call the magazine, it was an online thing, to please change my identity from actress back to artist as it was written. But I think, you stop making art, you start reading lots of books, you go for walks, you stop reading art forum, you stop tuning into the world around you. You can decide you're not an artist anymore. I mean, it's not,
I've always done a lot of things other than, I write, and I've also kind of taken up the role of a curator in certain situations. So it's not only sort of, whether it's being an artist, there's participating in the art field in ways that are not only making art or being an artist. There are other ways to participate. And I've also thought about, I actually was all set to train at a psychoanalytic institute in Los Angeles not so long ago because I was really so fed up. And then I didn't. At the end, in the end, there was a year lag, and then I didn't go through with it. And I did find a way to kind of come back and continue to participate. But at some point, there's a discussion of the word practice in the book, right?
Yes.
I can't remember
with
when that
Tammy
is.
Ray Carland, who in each act there's an artist who teaches,
Right.
And Tammy Ray, I think,
talk
is where
about-
we talk
'cause
about
that's-
practice.
So
And
it's
I
very
hate that
common
word.
now
Yeah.
for
And
artists to
actually,
talk about
Laurie
their
Simmons.
practice, not their work,
I
not
hate
their
that
work
word.
even as object or their work as activity. And I also hate that word.
I
But-
hate it so much.
But at the same time, I wish I could come up with some other word that I didn't hate that would serve the same purpose, because I think, there's a sense of, in terms of, so the idea that like an artist, it's your soul, you were born to be an artist, it's this kind of irreducible aspect of your identity or sense of self. And there are certainly parts of what I do that I think I would not be able to sort of say, well, yeah, that's not. There are parts of who I am and what I do that I don't think I could walk away from or change, even if I wanted to. And I've had some psychoanalysis, so. But that doesn't mean that those parts of myself have to be manifest in activities that end up being called art or end up being called the activities of an artist. And I think that that's where we sort of collapse. And when I thought I need to Google myth before I get on this panel, because I said that, but what does it mean? Yeah. And how do I define myth? And for me, a myth is a kind of cross between a fantasy and an institution. I'm not talking about kind of grand narratives of the hero's journey, but in fact a social construction that has a very particular history that's also internalized and that becomes part of the way we think about ourselves and the narratives in which we exist and we think about our lives and our trajectory. So that's how I understand.
Yeah, there's one quick
myth.
point that I would like to make, that I often make, which is that as artists, we do many things. We think we're architects. I've collaborated with fashion designers. I've acted. I'm making a movie. I write. I do all of these things, and I do them as an artist. God forbid someone who's not an artist should try to make art. We are like James Franco, no. You know, John Waters, you stay in the movies or whatever. We are so, and this is every artist
It's true.
to
We're very
a one.
territorial.
We do not
This
like
is-
outsiders trying to do what we do, yet we can do everything.
We're so full
and we
of
do
it.
it well.
Really.
Well,
mean,
the question is, how do you get that license?
No, it's like, yes, we can do anything. But,
yeah.
you know,
There's a
don't.
question from the front.
That's true. So true.
I'd like to know if you consider in your
No, we need it because we're recording, I think.
in your environment, have you met people who can do complex, complete different careers, such as physicians and artists? Do you consider them artists, or you refuse them as artists? How can you approach this? This is a very difficult question, personal question, actually.
I think what
think
Laurie
absolutely.
kind of almost already answered your question insofar as the artist role seems to be the one that can pull in almost any other one and still work. It's very hard for someone to have a very strong identity in another profession or even in the art world, but let's say as a collector, and then transform themselves into an artist who commands a consensus of belief.
Yeah. It's becoming more and more prevalent. For example, in Europe, I often see artist and theorist, for example, or artist and, as PhD programs in studio art expand, and particularly in the relationship between the art and the academic world, you see these sort of proliferations of kind of title that people apply to their work, and I do feel kind of skeptical. And so people want to list me as an artist and writer, and I would always say, no, I'm not an artist as writer, because writing is part of what I do as an artist. It's not a separate activity. And that was an important statement for me to make, because there's such an important history of artist writing. And I wanted to make a claim to that as being not a separate activity, but part of what an artist does. And so that's one of the sort of struggles over the definition of the artist, that has a long history, is expanding that definition, but as Laurie pointed out, and I think that that's very true, there's also a kind of power that expands, a sort of territory that we're expanding as we do that doesn't necessarily open things up. So.
Is this working? I have a quick question. It's a follow-up, actually, which is, there is, of course, one category of person who has a very strong identity or non-identity outside of the art world that is legitimized. I'm thinking about Massimiliano's biennial here, which is the outsider artist. And I wondered if you could speak about how that seems to be, I think, a growing, again, category, and how it does or doesn't function for, I guess it's a question for everybody, but for you, Sarah, in particular, because I do think it's interesting the way in which that particular strata seems to there's that kind of authenticity and myth around that kind of production that
Yeah.
does intersect with these other categories in interesting ways.
Absolutely, and that's actually a theme in Act 2 of the book, partly because Laurie has an interest in Tip and Laurie have an interest in outsider art. Cattelan has an interest in outsider art, and the Act 2 kinship starts and ends in Venice and ends at Massimiliano's biennial, in which there were a lot of outsider artists brought inside. And I think that it's like there are completely different criteria for the two worlds, and I do tend to call professional artists insider artists in reaction to the term, the appellation outsider artist. But it seems like the kind of rules around authenticity as pertain to outsider artists are actually from a previous era. So it's a kind of romantic, self-expressive version of painting like that which you might associate with Van Gogh, which is completely kosher within the outsider art world and completely anathema and disenfranchised as a myth inside the contemporary insider art world for the most part. And so it's interesting, a lot of the artists in the book are interested in outsider art, and I'd say Massimiliano is unusual amongst curators. Francesco Bonalmi offers a very different view and he sees the difference between outsider artists, insider art, he sees the difference as between professional artists and outsider artists as being that between a sommelier and a drunk.
Yeah, that's...
Well, between someone who's just compulsive, somebody who
Trains their compulsive.
Can train their.
Well, I felt, when I was rereading my sections, I realized that at the moment I saw your show, I was, I criticized it, which Sarah generously quoted in the book so that you could read it. And I remember my feelings at the time that I saw your show, and I am on record. I wrote about Morton Bartlett for Art Forum about 15 years ago. I am on record as being a supporter and having a great deal of interest in outsider art. But when I saw your show, at that moment I was having this tremendously protective feeling towards insider artists, particularly all the insider artists I knew that did equivalent things that had never been acknowledged in any way. So I was thinking, well, I know that this artist, and I had examples for every single outsider you included of an insider that I could insert into the show who could belong there in some way. So in a way, I feel like it was my protectiveness of my own tribe or clan, as I think of it, in terms of what you were doing. I don't know how you feel about that. I would love to know, but...
it's a conversation that I've been having probably for 1 year now since that show. And I can't summarize it in 10 talking points, but to try to simplify. First of all, going back to what we were saying about myths and also what Sarah was saying about the importance of myths in somehow distributing contemporary art also beyond the artwork. First of all, I wanted to use some of those myths that are associated with outsider art to recharge art with certain qualities that I think are lost at this point. So on many levels, my choice was also a critical position against a certain use of art that I see mostly in art fairs and in certain museums as a kind of self-enclosed masterpiece that you just stare at in what I call bovine stupor, and you just go, oh, it's beautiful, and you go home. So the inclusion of certain objects that the provenance of which was more complicated than the artist's studio allow me to suggest that art is more than just a decoration on the wall, and that art is a way to describe the universe through images or to learn about the universe through images. So there was a sort of movement towards re-enchanting art by using some of those myths that were kitsch, but they could be looked again if somehow they were coming from the back entrance and the window rather than from the front. Secondly, I think what I tried to make clear in the show was that there were many different ways of being outside and inside, and that connects to the question of the lady in the front. The show opened with Jung, who certainly is not a crazy artist. He was a doctor, and so
That's
I
up for
wanted.
debate.
Well, but I wanted to indicate that
Crazy
you can
doctor.
be an outsider.
Right.
And be recognized in another field and still be a dilettante in the show. Also, we shouldn't talk about this. My question was really the difference between the dilettante and the professional rather than the outsider and the insider. And ultimately, and then we'll talk about it in another occasion, I do strongly believe that when you set out to do what you do and what Morton Bartlett does, and in the moment you're giving form to something, there is no difference.
I agree.
And that I truly believe. I don't want to sound like a cheesy faucillon, but the moment the hand touches the matter, the intelligence that it's in the hand, it's the same. Then you might have more consciousness of your position within the art system and so on, but I do believe in the moment of forming, they're exactly the same. And so that was not a provocation. That's a strong belief I have. And I did think it was healthy to remind ourselves that, because otherwise we always look at the same art. Yeah. And so the bottom line was also how to be against an accepted canon that I find suffocating at this point. And how do you remix the canon? But we are here to talk about her book.
Right
There was a question in the back and one in the front, and then maybe we're almost done.
Mm-hmm.
Right. First, it was back there.
I had a question. I wanted to shift the discussion to the myth of the writer from the myth of the artist. And I was wondering if I haven't read the book yet. I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet. But I was wondering if your self-representation has shifted from 7 Days to this book. I mean, in 7 Days, it was kind of a myth of flirtatiously engaging transparency that kind of floats through these different environments. How has it played out here?
Well, I think there's continuity between the two books in terms of my voice. I mean, I see myself as fairly restrained. I was interviewed on stage last week in Ottawa, and the interviewer who'd read the whole book, he said, "I couldn't believe it. I got to page 182, and the only two things I knew about you is that you had a daughter called Cora and you have cats." Which had kind of come up through my interactions, cats with Ai Weiwei, and Cora had actually come to Beijing with me. So, it's written in the first person, and there's interactive questions, but it's not about me. I am very much interested in others. And that is an ethnographic modus operandi. I think, it's funny because when when I ask her what kind of artist is she says that she's a tattletale. And that she sees herself as the one who tells the family secrets. And I actually identify with that. It's kind of my role in relationship to the art world a little bit. These things are not discussed in quite this way. And I, just like going back to Massimiliano's question about the work and my definition of the work versus, where's his definition of the work in this? I feel like I'm breaking ranks and being a bit of a tattletale at times.
There was a question there.
He's good. That's excellent.
There are people I call artists that I think that I'm not sure that the artists actually call themselves artists, like Crumb, like our Crumb. He's a cartoonist. Or Team Lab, which is basically a group of coders. And there's a beautiful show at Japan Society that includes their work. How about artists that may not call themselves artists, but we call them artists?
And David Zwirner calls him an artist, right? I'm just trying to think, isn't that who represents our Crumb?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's like very powerful social institutions declaring him an artist in some way, shape, or form. And it does go back to a kind of a consensus of belief. Zwirner is a very powerful, very persuasive, is a very persuasive institution for designating something as art and therefore someone as an artist. Some art dealers represent designers nowadays too.
Like Newsom, Larry Gagosian.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. I don't know the other case in any detail.
Salon 94 works with Rick Owens and many designers and the objects that he and his wife make. I mean, there are a lot of cases where, I remember a time, I think it was the 80s, when architectural drawings were all the rage. They suddenly were, I think it was the late 80s, they were suddenly appearing in galleries and they were commodified and everyone had to be showing architectural drawings, drawings by architects. So, you know, these are things that kind of shape shift as we, you know, as culture changes, as the market looks for new things to gobble up and monetize, I think.
I mean, I think you can call anyone you want an artist. And, you know, and actually, far be it for me or anyone on this panel to police the definition. I think that there are lots of different versions of being an artist that are in the book, and I think one of the underlying themes is that it's a contested identity that is not easy to hold. It's not easy to have that authority and to be taken seriously. But it's still open and go at it.
Maybe one last question, and it was a good ending, but I won't leave you the last word.
Thank you for allowing one more question. I've enjoyed both your books. I got a chance to read it before it came out. One big difference, and the fact that you mentioned that you interviewed 100 artists before, so that you created this possibility that could have been a very different book that would probably stretch the attention span of most people's ability to separate the 100. But one of the experiences I find interesting about this book is that compared to, let's say, reading a biography of one artist, for instance, Tompkins on Duchamp, and very much like going to a solo retrospective, you get a really good sense of the interaction between the life of the artist and the work they produce. I mean, there seems to be this illusion, at least, that one explains the other. With your book, with the 33, it gets harder and harder. Although there are moments when you feel like, oh, okay, this is why this artist does what he or she does, or they do. But there are also other times when there seems to be a seemingly arbitrary relationship between the actual artist's life and the work they produce. Is that something that you thought about in coming with 33? Because it could
I
be
mean,
5 or 6.
my
Thank you.
methodologies. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for reading this book so quickly, and and for liking both the books. I think my methodology is different. So, you know, when I studied art history, there was this, you know, always a critique of biographical art history. You know, explaining the work with recourse to the biography of the artist. That is generally what you find. The modus operandi of this book is actually the opposite. I explain the character of the artist with recourse to the work. So it's actually just flipped right around. So, I mean, that doesn't answer your question, I can tell by the look on your face. But, or does it?
Well,
I'm not sure.
I agree with that. I mean, a lot of the art history I read seems to take the artist out of the equation, because that's supposed to be the grand, great art historian to do that. But I often find that I get a better explanation or understanding of the art when I know as many details as possible in a good biography or a good retro.
Can I ask something, the artist? Do you think knowing you makes your work, knowing you as through these representations or or through the representations in profiles and so on, does it make your work clearer, or because there are also different schools. Now there are some artists, and that's why I was being Maurizio many times, because he felt he didn't want to have an authoritarian relationship to his work in which he would say what it was about, and so there was somebody doing instead of him. And I'm curious from the artist if you feel...
But isn't that one of the myths of the art world? I mean, you never read a wall label in a museum about an artwork that,
Can you get
was I
closer?
not? Oh, I'm sorry. One of the myths of the art field. I mean, I don't think you ever read a wall label in an art exhibition that is not in some way sort of quoting the artists and the artist's discourse about their work, right? I mean, so we kind of say we don't want to reduce the work to the artist or explain the work by the artist's life, so it's a kind of biographical determinism. But the artist's discourse about the work, I think, plays a very, very important role, the way that art criticism and curatorial discourse tends to function. And there are very few instances. I mean, there are instances where artists also intervene.
Right.
I mean, and it's very common for artists to intervene in the accounts of their work to make sure that it corresponds. So there are these, I mean, there are these different categories, and maybe you have to be a little bit more specific, you know, between the kind of biography, as if the artist in that sense is just a kind of an object, and the artist as the subject of production of meaning around the work in terms of its discourse, which might not only be about sort of who they are biographically, but a lot of other things. But, you know, I do think that thinking about taking the position that what an artwork is and means has everything to do with its context, and that includes its social context, its historical context, but it also includes the context of the artist's work and of the artist's practice above all. Because, of course, an artwork, if you have a monochrome painting, you know, it was made by one person, you're going to make a very different interpretation of it than it was made by another person. So, I mean, you can compare objects that may be very, very similar in terms of their formal, aesthetic, semiotic qualities and so forth, but you're going to understand it in the context of an artist's work. But I'm not sure that artists necessarily, in their own production of meaning about their work, are always very clear about what they're doing or about what their work means or does, which is another question. Not that I don't think that that's a very important part of what an artist does, is try to produce meaning, and that's how the art world, in fact, I think, works to a very large extent. So.
I have to answer that question as briefly as I can. I have to say, after being a subject in Sarah's book, being profiled by Calvin Tompkins in The New Yorker, and being now profiled as artist parents in my daughter's book, I think that I can honestly say, besides being really sick of myself, that I don't feel that I feel like in the wall text it could say Laurie Simmons' post-World War II suburban upbringing has visually informed her work. Done. Look at the work. And that's after going, I just think that's where I am now, having read all of this stuff about myself and my life. I don't feel that it's really shed a tremendous amount of light on the work that I do. That said, it has really helped me contrive or create this character that I'm developing for this feature film, because I'm so conscious now of how artists are written about and the 100 facts they'll let out about their life and how we judge them. So it's almost pushed me into my next work. That's what I would say.
And I think, too, also the artists in the book, they talk about their work, but they also talk about each other, and they talk about their field. They talk about the art world. And I think, just going back to what Massimiliano was saying, I mean, I think Maurizio was extremely clever to get you to do his talking for him for 8 years, because you're much more articulate than he is. And that is like a really smart strategy. I think Cattelan's brilliant, but he's not really a talker. He's not great with words.
That in the book.
And he says that in the book. And actually, you are gifted with words. And, why not outsource the artist discourse as well? I think it's a really interesting strategy. No, I mean, you can outsource everything else, right? I'm surprised. Well, Oliver Eliasson has an in-house philosopher who writes all the
Artists outsource discourse all the time. I mean, that's
they do
partly
secretly.
What commissioning a catalog essay is. I mean, in fact, that is what commissioning a catalog essay is.
Not in that
it's
manner.
It's outsourcing discourse.
Yeah.
No, right. Not in the same way.
Did you feel used?
I think we have to end.
Okay.
I felt complicit for a long time, and I felt it was symbiotic. So we were using each other, which I guess is what people do when Sarah put me in the kingship chapter, and there is a sort of hint that Maurizio and I have some sort of familial relationship.
You're represented in bed with him.
I'm representing that, and I want to say it's not inspired by that the general idea for it. It was just by accident. But sorry, no. The question is, I think it was a symbiotic relationship, and it continued for a while, and after a while, it was probably too complicated on many different levels. And but yeah, I think that I don't know if he emerges from the book, but it's still surprising to me how much artists can achieve by existing within, not even communities, within small relationships. I always think Rauschenberg and Jones, or you think the Dadaists in Zurich were like 4 people. or in Cologne, they were like 3 people looking at each other, and with each other they made an audience, they made a critical mass, they listened to each other, and that to me is still always surprising every day, that it takes 2. I always say that art takes 2 people, because one is the artist, the other is the audience, and you trade those relationships continuously. And so we were, I think, using each other as probably you and Tip, Carol, somehow use each other, or you are there for each other.
I mean, we're there for each other isn't the... This would be, it's too bad we're not beginning now, because I also think that men tend to use each other in groups, and women historically tend to stand alone. And I'm sorry we didn't go there, because it's an amazing place to go. And also the issue that's brought up in the book that is really beneath engagement, whether or not a woman artist can have a child. So if we had another hour, it would be really great to talk about. But I think that what you guys did was different than what a male and a female, a husband and a wife artist were doing, just living in a house together.
Yeah, and we were in bed only once together, unlike you. I think that's all, no?
Yeah.
Before it gets too creepy.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Are you signing copies? Or?
I'm signing, yep. You want to say that?
So Sarah is signing copy of the book.
And you have a unique opportunity perhaps to get a few more signatures in your book if you like. And we are also joined by Jennifer Dalton and William Pauhida, who are here too. So there's... I hope they have pens.